Hi. Okay. Okay. Have a seat. Just sit.
Ladies and gentlemen, we feel that in a world where we're slowly trying to move away from body image issues and where we feel that the emphasis on how we look shouldn't be something that society continuously focuses on, that's why Side Government is proud to tell you that it's about time we abolish the sort of sports that celebrates vanity and celebrates everything that sports should not be in spirit of. In my speech, I'll tell you number one, how this socially engineers the society to focus on their body image, and secondly, how this is against the spirit of what the sports culture should be. Let's firstly analyze how the social engineers the society to focus on body image. Now, there's a need to understand what exactly, how exactly does the bodybuilding industry work. Basically, you build your muscles, you do everything you can to be as big and buff as possible. It's all in how your arms look and how your legs, your abs, I don't know, maybe Sadiq can relate to them, right? Like, these are the sort of vanities that these individuals always associate themselves with. We think this is an unhealthy obsession. Nobody should be that entirely obsessed in wanting to look that buff, especially when it's something that is extremely unnatural, right? They go up on stage, they flex their muscles, and people just come up and give scores. That essentially is what bodybuilding is. Why should we reward such a form of obsession towards their bodies, especially when we're trying to move away on how individuals should think about how they look, right? That's why we want to push away girls who are thinking that they should continuously be skinny. Then, if we're against models who look stick skinny, isn't it about time that we also abolish any forms of celebration that men should be as buff as they can, and that's how manly you should be? We think it's about time we stop that. This is different than things such as beauty pageants, right? Where beauty is subjective because it changes throughout time. You ask the ladies questions there, like we've always slowly, gradually changed as to what beauty can be. Like it's subjective in comparison to bodybuilding, where it's entirely objective. You put in yardstick and you see the bigger muscles you have, that's how you win. That's essentially how bodybuilding works, because if it wasn't about how big your muscles is, like, why is it called bodybuilding, right? It's different than modeling as well, because modeling, you have like different demands in markets. You see like even a change, whereas black models weren't hired before, they're highly hired now, right? You see a change as to what demands want, and you even have counter models such as plus size models. But when you talk about bodybuilding, there is no counter. You can't have a skinny man enter into a bodybuilding competition. That's just not how it works. We think it's about time we change it, right? The more muscular you are, that's how you become a champion. That's always a bar of how men should look, even though bodybuilding has its female category, right? But it's always been a manly sport, dominated and known for men. So let's analyze firstly how exactly does it affect men, right? It re-emphasizes what you ought to look like. They're in magazines, they're spokespersons of every product that is there in your face. There are crowns such as things like Mr. Universe, Mr. World, Mr. Asia. You need to be that. When a woman is called Miss Universe and you look at what Miss Universe competition is like, there are differing things, not just about how you look. But when you talk about the men who's Mr. Universe, Mr. World, all you talk about is how he looks, because that's the only thing he is judged upon, right? We don't think that we want that, because that means that because the way we perceive what we want is always like changed and to how we see the norms in everyday life and what society chooses to reward. The point at which men in society realizes that this is what we reward and this is what the society celebrates, it becomes in their thought and internalize that is what I want to be. The same sort of pressure affects women as well, because it then becomes the sort of impression as to what a woman should want. That means you socially engineer people to continuously want to focus on the body image, and that this is the only person that is worthy of having affection or any forms of rewards within society. No. Different than any other sports, man. Trust me, right? If you talk about Messi, a footballer, he's short, he's skinny, yet he's still one of the best footballers around, right? There's still that differing sort of perspective as to how we celebrate that. If you talk about Inzamam, right? He's a fat cricketer, but the fact that he's still highly celebrated and he's acknowledged for his skills just way beyond how he looks, that's how other sports can still be celebrated, but not one that that is a criteria that exists within bodybuilding, because bodybuilding couldn't care less about what you can do other than how you look. Yes, Tim.
Just in the same way, Messi and the rest of these sportsmen are given accreditation based on their assessments of achievements. Bodybuilding is not just about how you look. It's also about the assessment of how you've captured your passion to lift weights, because it is an choice.
Okay, number one, bodybuilding is different than weightlifting, right? But secondly, what passion is this? To look in the mirror every day and damn, I have good arms. Because by that logic, like, shouldn't there also be a celebration of passion of how skinny you can be? How we celebrate anorexia? We don't. Because we don't think that it's a healthy obsession for you to continuously be fixed on an objective standard of how you should look like. So again, you need to emphasize on that. But secondly, even though bodybuilding exists for female categories, it doesn't help either. It doesn't exactly help us combat as to what the sort of perception towards like female body image should be. Because if you talk about female bodybuilders, they're fit too. Because the issues of women on the ground aren't things such as like what type of fit should I be? Should I even have to be fit to begin with? Why can't I just be a woman who is just curvaceous or who has a little bit of flab and, you know, I probably don't have the best of abs or the best of arms? Because like it or not, bodybuilding is no different than the sort of pressure that it implicates on towards women that you have to be fit to a certain extent because that's the correct body that you should have. But secondly, how it's against the spirit of what sports culture should be. Because let's not kid ourselves, right? Bodybuilding is infested with the usage of steroids, right? There is no way that you can be that outrageously buff, that is not within the natural capacity of the human muscle contraction, right? There's no other way around it other than you actually having to use steroids, right? Sports is about how you shape your talents in the most natural way. Even though there exist footballers, badminton players out there who go through training, who go through like healthy diets, right? But it's still within the intakes of what the natural human capacity body can actually do, rather than building your muscles. Because have you seen how like huge the muscles of these guys are, right? Trust me, there is no way that this can be done other than the intake of steroids, right? If anything, that just means that it sets a precedent that to a certain extent, if the sports requires you to take steroids, and if that's the way that you can best achieve it, then either way, we will let you take it, or we'll at least put a blind eye to it. That's not what sports should be. We've always acknowledged sports as something that you can do with your body, like externalities, how hard you can dribble a ball, or how hard you can hit, like, you know, like when you're playing tennis, badminton, when you're playing football, the externalities that you can actually do with your body running, rather than just standing there flexing your muscles and suddenly that's a sport. Trust me, it's not. Because if that's how easy it is to categorize things as sports, shopping would have its actual competition and be considered as a sport. Because anything that is competitive is supposed to be a sport. Trust me, being competitive about how great you're supposed to look is not something we should celebrate. In anything that's vanity we want to abolish within society. For all these reasons, I'm proud of those.
Thank the Prime Minister for his speech. Now to begin the debate on the negative bench, I invite from the old and rusty Mr. Rubin to start the case in the opposition bench.
Yeah.
Yep.
As a former competitive bodybuilder myself, I'm appalled at the way they have distilled the essence of bodybuilding to one that is simply about aesthetics.
Yeah.
We think that's an extremely myopic stance coming out from side opposition. We will clearly define what exactly competitive bodybuilding really entails, as well as how it fits the exact definitions of sport, and ultimately how it should continue to be legal and in fact celebrated. What Mayor presented in the first speech was that bodybuilding somehow celebrates vanity and imposes unrealistic body image expectations upon society. First off, she exaggerates the impact of bodybuilding upon the psyche of society as a whole. Bodybuilding has never really enjoyed that level of success to ultimately influence men everywhere to aspire to that particular ideal. What in fact has more of a bigger impact on the expectations of society with regards to body image are the body images of things like celebrities or models, which enjoy far greater mass market appeal as opposed to competitive bodybuilding, which is still relatively obscure and only enjoyed success during the time of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Moreover, we think it's a very simplistic definition of competitive bodybuilding. Sure, you are judged on aesthetics, but more than that, ultimately, the only manner in which you are able to achieve the pinnacle of bodybuilding is if you push your body to the limits, right?
Yeah.
If you are able to build your body in a manner which ultimately defines you as a person. We think those sort of pushing yourself to the limit and breaking the sort of human boundaries is something that that's only present within bodybuilding as well as every other sport. But more than that, we think it's different from any other beauty pageants or modeling where you do ultimately, where you are judged on that body image, right? Here's the difference between those things and bodybuilding. The difference is when you are judged on beauty or the looks alone, right? You are judged on your genetic disposition, whether you are born with good looks and things like that. In fact, bodybuilding is the most equitable way in which, even if you are judged along body image lines, the most equitable and most accessible manner in which you are judged for that particular benchmark, right? Why? Because ultimately, everyone can gain access and build their body in that same manner, provided they have the drive, they have the passion, which is why exactly these bodybuilders are revered within that community, right? We think that's the very definition of any other sport, even if it was an unhealthy obsession, even if it influences men everywhere to aspire to that ideal. Why is that a bad thing? We can never take it at face value just because you strive towards a particular ideal. Ultimately, we realize it must be the choice of the individual to actualize his own individual appearance, his own individual self in a manner that he chooses fit. So we don't think that that's something that should be restricted just on the basis of imposing itself upon other people. But before I go on, yes, Uber.
If they don't reward genetic disposition, why is it that all Mr. World have either been Caucasian or black?
That's not true, right? Because there are different weight categories. For the smaller Asian build, they participate in smaller weight categories and they are rewarded as well, right? So we don't see any other, we don't see how it's not equitable in any sense. But let's get to the core of this debate. What exactly are the benchmarks for a legitimacy of any sport? That's something that side of the government failed to answer. We argue that the definition of any sport, right, it is the greatest human endeavor. It's a recognition that we are mortal beings with real physical limits, but through sport, we attempt to break through and surpass our limited physicality. Right? To demonstrate that physiological, psychological, even spiritual barriers will never restrain us. That is the core of our humanity. We attempt not only to excel, but to exceed. Government's burden was to show why competitive bodybuilding never fulfilled these ideals of sports that are enshrined in sporting organizations like the Olympics, right? When exactly do we ban any sport? That's something that was never discussed in Prime Minister major failure on their part. We argue there are two benchmarks. First off, any sport is banned when it presents a significant threat of death, right? That's why your gladiator battles, your wrestling with animals and things that were considered sports like way back then are banned right now, right? We argue that harm to your body alone is insufficient, assuming that bodybuilding and steroid use is rampant within a particular competition, right? We argue that the vast majority of sports are never risk averse. The risk of physical harm, in fact, is a critical component of any sport. In order to surpass the boundaries of human capacity, we bear the risk of hurting ourselves in the process, right? That's why the risk of injury and not being able to compete ever again is present within any other sport, right? What then do we attempt to do with regards to this harm in sport? We try to regulate it and limit the level of harm. Like what Mer said in her speech, right, was clearly untrue. Steroid use is banned within competitive bodybuilding. You can get to that size without the use of steroids. If I show you a picture of me 5 years ago, you will believe that, right? But more than that, even if steroid use was legal, let's say it was being used, what is the problem then? Assuming that we can impose safety restrictions and have a safe and regulated use of steroids, we don't see an issue there, right? So we argue that you do need to present some sort of harm to yourself in order to surpass those boundaries, right? We don't think that this sort of that mere benchmark of harm is enough to ban the sport entirely. The second benchmark that we use to judge any sport and the legitimacy of such is that if it compromises those sporting ideals that I mentioned earlier. We don't think that competitive bodybuilding really fits that particular definition, right? They are the same as any other sport. Why is this so? Because it involves exceeding your physical boundaries. You require a great deal of determination, a great deal of passion, as well as ultimately the drive to go through with those sort of exercises in order to build your body to that particular size, right? We don't think it's the antithesis of any sport. In fact, it enjoys far greater similarities to any other sport. Moreover, it is equitable, as I mentioned earlier, right? If you look at football, at tennis, at track and field events, your genetic disposition tends to dominate your potential success in the sport. However, with regards to bodybuilding, that is never the case, right? Because you're judged on your capacity based on your limitations to exceed them and ultimately fit the best possible ideal that you can ultimately fulfill. For all these reasons, we're very proud to defend bodybuilding.
Thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. Continuing the case in the proposition bench, I invite the Deputy Prime Minister Arena. Here.
Two rebuttals before I move on to my argumentation, which is the trickle-down effect of this sports, which probably would then further show to you why this sport should be banned. If mere speech wasn't good enough to Ruben, apparently it wasn't. 2 points of argument, 3 rebuttals, right? Number 1, how sport is the greatest human endeavor. Here's the thing, right? Just because it's competitive does not necessarily mean you have to make it into a sport. Because according to Ruben, apparently, that this is something about encompassing our limited capabilities and breaking barriers and making sure that our body goes against our limits. That's completely fine. But the yardstick here, ladies and gentlemen, is different, which is compared to different other kinds of sports, which is probably football, badminton. Here, the yardstick is how you look. We think that the yardstick here, although fine, you do work hard, there is passion, there is determination, but at the end of the day, you are judged by how big you are, what kind of muscles that you have, especially when considering, we think even bodybuilding, right? It's also, you even have categories of the best arm, best leg, best abs, best butt, whatever it is. We don't think that's the kind of categories that we want to have in sport, right? Because if you want to talk about also, what Tim apparently in his speech, it's about how you lift weights. But if you want to talk about capabilities of lifting weights, you already have weightlifting competitions for that, which actually determine how much you can lift weights and actually judge you by the fact that you can lift more weights than others. So we don't think that in this instance it is within the spirit of sports, because the outcome of it, or what you're telling society because of this, is not what sports is all about. It's not about being competitive anymore. It's about how you look at the end of the day. Especially when you're talking about other kinds of sports, this is not the kind of thing that we want to endorse. Second point of argument, rebuttal here in my speech. He talked about how this is completely different than beauty pageants, because apparently now this is more equitable as compared to other things where it's apparently based on genetic disposition. Huge concession, because even in his reply to our rebuttal was that you even notice that even men are in different categories. You see more Asian men in the lighter categories just because they cannot, make sure that their bodies are big enough to enter into those categories. And this is not something new in sports. That's why you see a lot of Africans entering into long distance running. You see a lot of Asians entering into badminton.
Yes,
and you see a lot of Caucasians entering into tennis, for example, right? These are the kinds of things that you already enter into sport. But even if you want to diminish the idea of beauty pageants not being similar, you still need that beauty pageants, these women generally do have to work out. These women have to be fat. These women have to be fit. These women have to also not only be fit, but also have to be intellectual. They have to be good, for example, in terms of what they want. They have to know about general knowledge and good issues, because at the end of the day, they do ask about their opinions of how they want to make the world better. So there are different criteria, and the criteria are actually more conclusive as compared to these bodybuilding competitions that these guys wanted to talk to you about, right? So apparently, what have we saw here in this debate, right? We saw that the only thing that side opposition has in this debate is the idea of sports in competition. If that were the case, in any other instance, you can make it into a sport as well. Shopping, being an anorexic, for example, because these things take hard work and determination too. But there has to have a judgment as to where that hard work and determination is going into and whether it's valuable or not. Here, it's not valuable. They have to come up to us and tell us what's the added value of allowing an individual to become a bodybuilder and having all these things that I'm going to talk to you about, but at the same time, not just to argue that it's their choice. We don't really think choice is valid here in this debate. first point of argumentation, argumentation in my speech, the trickle-down effect of men. There are 3 levels to that. Number 1, we don't think that right now it pressures individuals to even push to go and take steroids, even if you want to go and outlaw steroids and ban steroids in sports, but because the competition is about how big you can get and how much weight you can lift, even if that were true, we think that the individuals who naturally became buff after that will be pressured because there's no other way around it. Because of the human capabilities that have limitations, unfortunately, had such a tragedy, individuals now have to go and push themselves even further and find other ways to chemically enhance their bodies so that they are pushed into that kind of corner to ensure that their bodies do become bigger and do become better. So that's a trickle-down effect if you have these competitions, even if you want to outlaw things such as drugs and performance-enhancing drugs, because that's the only way for these men to get around it because of the genetic disposition that we talked about earlier on. Before I move on, sure.
Yeah, so that's not a harm to ban this sport, because by that logic, let's ban every other sport that has a susceptibility of using performance enhancing drugs.
No, that's not true, because here the yardstick of those other things, it is based on your capabilities. It's different, right? We're talking about football, for example. It's not just strength, it's about strategy and it's about skill. If you're talking about badminton, it's also the same thing. Here, it's about size, right? Here it is about size. Well, that's what she said, right? We think that in these instances, that's not the kind of yardstick that we want. In all other sports, things such as strength is not the only factor. Things such as size are not the only factor, because it's subjective, and sports is an all-encompassing idea that they have not been able to grasp here in this debate. Second level of argumentation on how this creates an inferiority complex, or kind of value that extends towards men and the gender norms within society. We feel that just because of these kinds of bodybuilding images, it actually dictates what a man should look like. Mr. Universe, Mr. World, Mr. Asia. We think that the kind of idea of what a man should look like, which is big and buff and muscular, is not something that's very good for the general populace of society, because it's not what everyone wants. It's not the reality of society as well. Not only is this harmful towards men, because they are now pressured to ensure that they become bodybuilders as well, and you're not only influencing people who enter into the sport, but people who don't even enter into the sport to take drugs themselves because they want to live up to Mr. World and they want to live up to Mr. Universe. It affects women on the other hand as well, because women now see that's the epitome of a man. He has so much testosterone, he must be the manliest man on the world, and we don't think that's the kind of yardstick that we want to tell into the entire. That's the kind of yardstick that we want to show to the other girls, and envisioning what a man should be. We have so many types of men within society: skinny, tall, short, whatever it is, even if they're not buff. That's the kind of society that we want to introduce, and the kind of society that we want to nurture, instead of looking at just muscles and being buff altogether. But being buff altogether. So we don't think that this is the kind of inferiority complex that we want to continue. If you look at when it comes to these bodybuilding competitions, it's even exacerbated and glorified. You bring these men into beaches, for example, and you take pictures with them, Mr. Miami, Mr. Beach. So these are the kinds of influences that you have within society, and it's so far-reaching, right? Because it's not only just when it comes to just in front exposure, it comes on television, it comes on magazines, it comes in movies, for example. Every time you see a buff man, you automatically have the inclination that he is really manly and he is really masculine, as compared to a person, as compared to a regular person that you see within the street. So that's the kind of connotation that we want to avoid. Third point that we talked to you, that I want to bring to you here, is an idea of marketing as well. We see that how individuals, especially when we talk about big companies who sell all these performance-enhancing drugs or sell products in general, just to go and change the way you look, are actually preying on the insecurities of individuals. We don't think this is the kind of analogy that we want in society. We don't like marketing strategies. We don't like all of these things preying on the insecurities of individuals. The same way of how we also ban whitening creams, for example, in the past, which changes the way you look and changes the appearance that you are, even though that's the way you're born with. We think that it's the same principle here, because we don't want society to conform to an ideal of what a man should look like, or what a woman should look like, or what a fit woman should look like. We want society to be happy with the way they are, and that's the far-reaching harm that they need to deal with here in today's debate. It's no longer not about competition, ladies and gentlemen. Competition can always exist, but the value of the competition here is what's important, and they did not prove that. We're very proud of it.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Now to hear the response from the Deputy Leader of Opposition, I'd like to invite Habib from Old and Rusty. Here.
Mr. Speaker, what we have on site government, at best we can call it a shadow case. What we have on government case is that a team that wants to say that any form of judgment based on aesthetics is automatically bad. Because the conclusion that they draw up in their mind is that the moment you're judged on any form of aesthetics, it will probably equate to a girl being anorexic. We don't think so. There are many different types of sports where you judge people on the aesthetic value. For example, you have individuals, what do you call that sport, when you swim together, synchronized swimming, right? There's an aesthetic value there because it's free. Thank you guys, right? You also have, that's one of the prime examples, right? You can't just take out the entire portion of how some sports are judged. Mr. Speaker, a couple of rebuttals before I go on to my argumentation. I promised to be talking about the idea of celebrating aesthetics later on, but before that, a few responses. First and foremost, we already told you from side opposition that when it comes to drug abuse, when it comes to performance-enhancing drugs, these things are the status quo regulated and banned. So if you sit down, if you have a problem with regards to them abusing these drugs, then ban the drugs and make sure the regulation is much tougher. So we don't have individuals going up there and saying, I'm Mr. World and Mr. Universe, and then at the back of everyone's mind is probably because he's on steroids. That's not the debate, right? It's a shallow idea we want to move away from. Secondly is the idea of inferiority complex. This is a bit odd. It's like them telling me that when I stand next to a black man, because the steroid that they hang it long, right, it's well hung, right, I'm going to be inferior. That's not entirely true. But even if that's the case, everybody is inferior. Everybody sometimes do feel inferior to other people around them. But the problem is, they are targeting and saying that bodybuilding specifically targets people and makes people feel inferior to their muscle mass without realizing it's not just about the beauty. The conclusion you have from government is that bodybuilding is bad because they are judging you based on the outcome of how you look in the end, without realizing that there's an entire process that goes there between you looking like a skinny ass lady and then you looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? We talked about this earlier. You have discipline, you have diets, you have to carry weights to become a bodybuilder, right? It's a precursor. And then at the same time, you have a system that you must achieve. You have a goal that you must set, and you must achieve that, or else you're not going to look very good. But when we say we're not going to look very good, what does it mean? It's not just about being big and bulky. No, the categories are there for a reason. They must be aligned. You can't look like you are a cone. You have big abs and then you have small, tiny feet. You must be proportionate. All these things are actually quite healthy, telling you to keep fit and at the same time make sure your body mass is in proportionate sizes so you don't topple over when you walk in the next step, right? Next thing is the idea of how bodybuilding individuals or participants are judged. They say that's all about how they look in the end. How they look in the end is after tons of months of years of hard work of what they have achieved during that period of time. So you can't just judge them based on what they look at the end, but rather you have to judge the entire process. When you go for this Mr. World, Mr. Universe, these individuals are not just judged by how much muscle they have. They are judged by all the things they have put into place before they achieve that particular outcome. Lastly is the idea of categories. They say that there's a concession, right? We don't think so. Our idea here shows that there's access. There are categories, of course. That's based on your skeletal mass. If you're born Asian and you want to compare yourself to a Caucasian, obviously your skeletal mass is going to be much smaller. You can only build that much muscle around your skeletal mass. But the point is, the categories are there and it's accessible. Let's look at the standards that we set from side opposition. We said that the only time you can ban a sport is when there is significant threat of death, where harm that kills you, or secondly, the harm that occurs to your body the harm that occurs to your body is minimal and marginal. That's how you become a better athlete. That's how you go the extra mile when you start off as a runner or you start off as a bodybuilder. We have standards that everyone can access in comparison to this blanket idea that, oh, look, everyone's just going to look pretty, and our problem is that we don't like people thinking that they should look like that, looking pretty, right? Before I go on to celebrating the idea of aesthetics, go on.
Sir, a model goes through so much work to be extremely skinny. Her thick, skinny hair is proportionate to her thick, skinny legs. Why is that not competition yet? Would you
see, this is where it doesn't make sense. A model, right? They talked about categories of plus size models. Let me tell you what a plus size model is now. Size 3, that's a plus size model. That's more than my freaking shoe size, okay? Now let's look at the reality of the situation. If you have a model that goes through all these diets to make sure that they look good, we don't have a problem, which is exactly what we talk about. If they fulfill the criteria that we talked about, is accessible, then so be it, it can be a competitive sport. But you need to come up here and tell us, with regards to these standards we've set, why is these standards still not enough? And you guys are setting standards that are arbitrary or subjective. Let's go on to the last idea, celebrating aesthetics. This is where we feel we have a very big problem inside government. They come up here and tell you that it's wrong to have a message being sent to society that it's okay to look pretty. They themselves consider that beauty is subjective. When it comes to bodybuilding, there is an objective standard we have set. When it comes to subjectivity of how people look, what is wrong with you feeling that you want to look like that person, like the bodybuilder? What is wrong? Okay, like, I am fat right now, but I want to look like Malik. No, I want to make sure that I have a body before I marry, right? Or else I want to be fatter. Okay, so my point is, there is nothing wrong in idolizing these individuals because you want to be like them. When you say you want to be like them, you can't just assume that these individuals are going to have an anorexic behavior. If you want to become like Malik Noor, you can't just say, oh, they're going to end up looking like Malik Noor, without realizing that they have to go through the same process that is accessible under our model to achieve that body that Malik Noor has. Cannot come up here and say that celebrating aesthetics is wrong without telling us why aesthetics is unimportant. In a society where people are judged on how they look anyways, you need to understand that people have comfort zones. And if they choose to look like a certain individual, it's because they feel comfortable looking like that individual. They need to come up and tell us why that is absolutely wrong and absolutely problematic. Mr. Speaker, in a nutshell, this is what I told you, right? When it comes to individuals deciding how they want to look like, it is up to them. You cannot vilify individuals who have worked hard and then eventually achieve that body and judge on that hard work and the fact that hard work has brought the beauty that they define as beautiful. Side opposition wants to tell you one very clear thing. When it comes to these individuals, we don't think it's superficial. We think they've worked hard for it. It's accessible. That's why we're doing it.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now, to end the debate, the constructive part of the debate on the government bench, I invite the Whip Speaker, Mubarak from IUA.
Let's break down Lubin's awesome criteria. First, it shouldn't be harmful to them. First, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the average age of death of a bodybuilder. It's 50, as opposed to 70 in the developed world, ladies and gentlemen. That essentially means the point at which you become a bodybuilder, you are putting your life and your health at risk. Second, ladies and gentlemen, the thing about steroids, right? They said, oh, we can ban it, we can regulate this, whatever. But they never really answered the premise and the point of this argument. The point of this argument is this. In other sports, there are other things which you can consider. That means strength or stamina are not the only criteria. There are other things you can develop without the usage of steroids. Therefore, there is a perverse incentive on these athletes, not just these athletes, but the sporting authorities themselves, to allow the usage of steroids and let it go under. The fact that they have said that it's not successful means that there is added pressure on those sporting authorities to also then allow the unregulated usage of steroids. The third reason, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, a lot of people are not genetically disposed to becoming like that, ladies and gentlemen, which means Asians also then feel pressure to also take it. The point at which some people already take it means other people are also then pressured into taking it because they know otherwise they will lose. And the only criteria that makes them win is how they look. And steroids darn well help doing that, ladies and gentlemen. That means there's a perverse incentive, not just by athletes, but the professional, but the sporting authorities themselves to ensure that this happens. We think that first criteria we've already filled that, right? Second, apparently genetic disposition is a criteria because we don't want to reward genetic disposition. First, we already they had to take a step back once they said that because they consider that Asians also have different criteria, right? And then Habib came, oh, but it's still accessible, right? But the point at which it's still genetically disposed, they're still genetically weaker, ladies and gentlemen, means that argument and that criteria falls as well. But we also tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that people are born with different body types as well. I, ladies and gentlemen, can give 90 push-ups, but I don't have half as big an arms as Sadiq, who can give 50, ladies and gentlemen. The point is here that people are born genetically different, and that means their reward structures are different and how they work out as opposed to their genes, ladies and gentlemen. So based on their own criteria, that if it fits, like if you're only rewarding genetic dispositions, then this makes sense. Then you should ban it, that is also fulfilled. But third, right? They said there's nothing wrong with celebrating aesthetics, and there's nothing wrong with, there's synchronized swimming, that's aesthetics. Number one, that takes a lot of teamwork. Number two, ladies and gentlemen, that is a sport where you actually have a skill, where you actually jump around and you do it with your proper timing, etc., etc., right? Second, what is wrong with basing it completely on aesthetics? We give you sufficient analysis on that. First, ladies and gentlemen, there's societal pressure on these individuals to continuously look a certain way. That means, ladies and gentlemen, if you're high school grade, there is a lot of pressure on you to hit the gym. It's not okay for you to just study because there are certain expectations you must meet. This means in order to have a girlfriend, you must have this much abs. We think that's a problem, the point at which people are pressured into these kinds of lifestyles. But two, ladies and gentlemen, this means also women are then continuously told that the point at which you have a girl, you need to have a boyfriend, and that boyfriend also needs to fulfill these certain criteria, right? And we think that's problematic. Third, ladies and gentlemen, we told you it's particularly harmful on women because even the alternative body image that exists for women through bodybuilding is an image that says you also need to be darn well fit. We think that's very problematic, ladies and gentlemen. They say you are judged in society anyway, and therefore we should allow it. The fact that a wrong goes on doesn't mean we should perpetuate that wrong, ladies and gentlemen, and allow society to go on in that path. We are the only side in this house today that actually cares about pushing society to a level where they don't care about how you look before they judge you. We think that's a criteria that side opposition has completely failed. You might talk about the value of sports and whatever, but at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, we think what happens to society is the most critical, right? Yes, these people work hard, but at the end of the day, they don't add a value to society. They add a negative value to society, which re-emphasizes the idea that people should be judged on how they look. We think it's fine to ban that sport, and we down below should do it. Before I move on,
how are you changing the minds of everyone in society when you're banning a sport that is seemingly obscure and the people who have the most amount of media are people in the movies?
I have two responses. The first response is that then their own arguments about teaching you to be healthy, etc. won't work if they are themselves saying it's not a successful sport. But the point at which the sport exists, regardless of whether or not a lot of people follow it, is a re-emphasization of society's values that people should look a certain way. They talk about Hollywood celebrities having to look a certain way, ladies and gentlemen. But where do these celebrities get that value as well? We think these are individuals in society will have this kind of sports and not other kind of sports. It doesn't matter if these people are popular or not. The existence of this sport itself tells society that this is something we value as opposed to something else. We think that's particularly problematic in this instance. But second, ladies and gentlemen, they said it teaches you to be healthy, etc. Right? We don't think that's a healthy way to live. But first, ladies and gentlemen, and they say, oh, you have like proportional bodies. Number one, right? I'll tell you, they have categories such as called best arm. That means some professional athletes, ladies and gentlemen, continuously pressurize on one part of the body as opposed to others in order to win certain categories. Second, ladies and gentlemen, often certain people put pressure on a certain area because that's their strength. So even if their legs are skinnier, that means they want to put pressure on the upper body because that is going to get them the win, because that's their strength. We think those are the kind of strategies that these people take, ladies and gentlemen, which are very harmful to them as well. We think that's very problematic. Last idea. They continuously told us that they work hard and therefore they should be allowed to do it. We understand that they are very passionate about this issue. But the point at which, ladies and gentlemen, your work doesn't get a value in society. We don't think, and this is a criteria that never really tells, we don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that sports should just be, if there's competition, that's allowed. We think sports in itself adds a value to society, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's a criteria they need to deal with. Because as Arina said, right, shopping or anorexia will also be values because they can be competitive as well, and therefore they could be sports as well. But they're not, because they don't add positive value to the idea of society. So regardless whether you want to do it or not, that's fine. If you want to talk about things such as weightlifting, we're okay with allowing these people to continue to weightlift, right? We're absolutely fine with that. But the point at which, ladies and gentlemen, the only value they put on is showing how big their muscles are. We have a problem with that. Because we think that retells society and re-emphasizes this idea that looks are what's the most important. We have a big issue with that.
And the government will speaker for that speech. Now, to conclude the constructive debate in the negative bench, I invite Tim as the opposition whip. Here.
reconcile what is fundamentally wrong about the celebration of aesthetics or the appreciation of beauty that the three of them have. And I think it came out clearly from Mubarak that it creates a certain societal pressure that festers into something that becomes normal, and therefore people aspire to be that and set a standard tone of beauty. But the argument stopped there. You see, societal pressure and creating somewhat of a new norm, pushing for a set standard, doesn't necessitate a state intervention to ban something if you don't show that the societal pressure, however pressurized it may be in a society, to the point where it actually harms an individual. So the conclusion to that societal pressure was the benchmarks that Ruben set in this debate. Yes, we do agree that there are societal pressures that exist. We do agree it might create some form of idolization and a set standard of beauty. But for you to come and tell us that there shouldn't be a set standard of beauty, that it is wrong if a certain pocket of society wants to celebrate a certain form of aesthetics. We question your moral legitimacy in establishing nuances where you decide what should and shouldn't be a benchmark. We think, let people who want to celebrate those forms of idolization, we can do that. Yeah. And using this platform as a for bodybuilding is a perfectly fine way of doing that. The problem we have with idolizing, man, because that seems to be the only counter devil's advocate you have, that people might die from it. You can't die from bodybuilding, right? Mubarak likes to lie, and I know this. I hope this doesn't become a habit. The average age of dying for bodybuilders is not 55. There is no best arm in bodybuilding. You can't have that. What you naturally have in these types of situations is the appreciation and the idealization of aesthetics, and it is also incorporated what Habib said, where we appreciate the amount of effort and the achievements that we've had within the bodybuilding sphere. And that is aligned with every other sport that we have. And then they realized it was a sinking ship. They decided to hop on the segregation portion of sports. Yes, in every sport, we understand that based on your background and your genetic disposition, there are limitations. That's why Nadal will never play in Maria Sharapova in a tennis match. We are all segregated by sports according to genetic disposition. The difference between the celebration of aesthetics in a catwalk platform is that your genetics disposition can't change. This is the only portion of the celebration of aesthetics where it's accessible to everyone, and it is based purely on your specific ambition to achieve that final goal, if that is your ambition. Even if there are harms that they alluded to, they never proved at any one single point in each of their 7-minute speeches that this is the final point that broke the camel's back, in which a state needed to come in and ban something. At which point this societal pressure necessitates a state intervention. We never got what line that was being drawn there. So the second thing I want to talk about is what exactly are they trying to achieve when they ban these types of competitions? What are the societal progressive values? Are you changing, or are you naturally progressing towards? Are you telling people that there shouldn't be a set standard of beauty, or are you telling people to set different standards of beauty? And the point that we're trying to make in opposition is this, that so long and so forth, there are no imminent death threats to you, and there are no specific harms that can alter the course of life. Why is setting that very standard of beauty such a bad thing? That's the clincher of today's debate, which is why we think we've got the better deal. We've also told you two important things that went largely untouched. It's an assessment of achievement of an individual, and they call it a set standard of beauty. Arina and I have had this discussion before. She thinks that a person without ambition is fine, and I disagree. We've had this back and forth. We've had this anyway. The point is this: why shouldn't we celebrate the point of ambition and the point of passion of an individual to achieve something, even if it comes at the expense of setting a set standard of beauty? That's the point that we're trying to make, and we haven't got that from Go.
Okay, your stance for government proposition is really unclear. First off, we were talking about you wanted this because it's a sport. Second is to show people to be fit. Now it's something you're okay with the meaning aesthetically. So what's your line of opposition bench here?
It's an appropriation of what I think you're the one that's not understanding any of this. It is a sport. It has always been a sport. You're the one that brought up the argument of aesthetics. You've got a problem with aesthetics being celebrated and idolized and set standard of beauty. And we tell you that even if bodybuilding celebrates all those things, it's completely fine. We're okay with it, which is why we're still okay with beauty pageants, even if it celebrates genetic disposition, no matter what. It's fine to set those standards. And even if it's not fine, Mr. Speaker, we argue to you that a state to intervene and ban something without recognition of imminent harms is something that we will not stand for. You know, even if you want to talk about the celebration of aesthetics, I fundamentally disagree that when we watch these shows that we want to immediately hit the gym. You're a relatively good-looking guy. Rafik is a relatively good-looking guy. Yet among all the males in this room, Habib is the one that's getting married this year. So no, these societal pressures don't indicate every single male to jump into the gym and immediately hit the ropes in order to achieve these kinds of things. Lastly and finally, no thank you, Mubarak. What is a sport and what constitutes a sport is not the debate. It's about even if bodybuilding is necessarily in this line of argument, whether it should be a legitimate sport or not. What we fundamentally think is problematic on both sides of the coin is when you start putting platforms and delineating lines of what should and shouldn't be recognized as a sport. As long as it fits that ulterior motive of challenging the human limitation and understanding their physical capabilities and things you can't achieve and pushing that boundary, we're perfectly fine. Using the other model of performance enhancement drug, like the last one I came from Marina was extremely funny. According to her, it will now push, there's a trickle-down effect and more people will start using performance enhancement drugs. By that logic, you should ban athletics as well, because performance enhancement drugs allow you to run faster, jump higher, and swim faster. That is not an argument to ban a sport. What we will question and throw the question back to them in the reply is when you come and tell us that the state needs to intervene and ban something, Mr. Speaker, you've really got to show far more harm than this, whereby it creates societal pressure, and that's somehow a bad thing. We're happy to respond.
I thank the whip for that speech. Now to conclude the opposition bench as a whole, let's have the whip speaker, Ruben. Here.
The reason why Sai government lost for PM is that they had never once attempted to argue why the act of competitive bodybuilding should be made illegal. They argued that the benchmarks for that are far higher. They have never once engaged us on those particular benchmarks. So let's look at the first issue. How best do we judge the legitimacy of sport, and by extension, when do we exactly ban the sport? The argument was very simplistic. If you're judged on aesthetics and aesthetics alone, it shouldn't be a sport, and it should be banned. First off, we responded and said there are a number of sports which are judged on aesthetics. With rhythmic gymnastics, ice skating, synchronized swimming. Their response in Mubarak's speech alone was, oh, you need skill for this activity. Wait, you don't need skill for competitive bodybuilding, you don't need skill to alter your diet or lift weights. That's clearly ignoring what competitive bodybuilding is all about. The second issue was that a focus on aesthetics within the sport has a negative influence on society. We contested that, right? Because that's clearly not true. Bodybuilding never once enjoyed the same sort of mass market appeal as do other sports like football or tennis. So we don't think it has that sort of insidious influence that everyone's thinking about becoming a competitive bodybuilder or achieving that same size. But even if it did, right? Even if we focus on aesthetics, is it an inherently bad thing? We've argued that in fact it's good, especially in the context of competitive bodybuilding. You've got good muscle definition, it's an indicator of that. Why was that ever an issue? But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this body image is bad, right? And it does have the top influence. Since when has that ever justified a ban? A question I asked very early on in my LO speech, right? All sorts of mass media avenues advocate some sort of bad body image ideal that they wanted to prevent. has there ever been the benchmark for making it illegal? We ban runway walks with stick-in fashion models. We ban celebrities like showing skin and showing their slim bodies on MTV. We've never done that. So let's look at the context of sports, right? It's insufficient to claim that just because it has some sort of negative influence on society, therefore we must ban a sport entirely. We have never banned any sport based on those benchmarks alone, right? Why? Like if you look at the vast majority of sports, especially those with regards to like mixed martial arts or like boxing and things like that, you can argue that it has an influence in terms of promoting violence, because the clear objective is beating the shit out of your opponent. But we've never banned it. So we don't think that just because we have a negative influence, therefore it should be banned. The degree of harm has to be far greater than that. And we clearly established that either it's antithesis to sporting ideals, something we never contested, or it possesses a very significant threat of death. When you participate in the activity, more likely than not, you will die. Even if you die at 50 because you're a bodybuilder, like we don't see that an issue. Like football players, especially American football players, like suffer the risk of concussions and mental illness later on. Same thing with boxing, we've never banned that. So we don't see how that was ever sufficient to really ban a particular sport, especially competitive bodybuilding. But more than that, they failed to respond to Habib's speech entirely. We talked about the harms of enforcing such a ban with regards to competitive bodybuilding. First off, he showed you why it delegitimizes the sort of hard work that these people have put in. It's a refusal to recognize their achievements in exceeding human physical capability. But more than that, it sends a normative message that these individuals should be vilified and rejected. If they're all about acceptance of people of different body sizes, why then should we reject and reject that sort of body image just because you think it influences other people? Why not let's have competitions on how fat you are. We don't see that as a particular issue. We don't think we should ever compromise on our ideals of sports. And that is why we're very proud to defend competitive bodybuilding.
Thank you, Ruben, for that speech. Now to end the debate as a whole, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister back to the podium with the government advice speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, their yardstick to making things sports is only, their yardstick towards banning things, right, as a sport is only when death is caused. Then okay lah. When I walk out of this room, I want to see pornography be made part of Olympics. I want to see like shopping be made a sport. I want to see things just, you know, how fast you pick up the phone when your angry girlfriend calls be, you know, a sport. Anything that doesn't cause death should be a sport. In my space, there are two issues. Number one, should bodybuilding be considered a sport? And number two, should we even celebrate aesthetics to begin with? Opposition tells us, yes, we should celebrate bodybuilding as a sport because it's competitive. What did we say? We told you that competition is not the yardstick. Because by that logic, anything in life is a competition. But it's about what is that value of that competition. Because sports is also about value in essence, what you can do with your body, not just about being made. At best, opposition told us, well, yeah, they had, you know, so much effort. They lift weights. There's a competition called weightlifting. Oh, they eat healthy, they eat celery and carrots. Okay, then fine, let's have an award for that. Because even Ruben conceded in his annual speech, right, was that, guys, yes, they go through so much effort, but at the end of the day, they are judged for their looks. That is the problem that government has. Yeah. Should you be rewarded for your looks? And that's not what we want. Because even like Mubarak said in his speech, right, because don't lie, these efforts are things that you are judged upon when you talk about when you talk about bodybuilding. Because there is no such interviewer that comes up to you before the scores are given and before the rewards given and distributed. Hello, hi, how are you? What do you go through to become that, you know, paid? No. That isn't how you evaluate the person. You evaluate the person on looks. That was still something that was failed to be engaged by side opposition. But we've already told you, right, that sports is about what you can do. There should be an exertion of force with like something you can do with your body, not just stand there, look good, flex your muscles. That's not something we reward. Thirdly, was this issue that they chose to just dismiss, steroids. They told us, well, we can ban it. It's already banned, and people still use it. it's still a culture within this sport. So the issue then becomes, should we still allow people to continuously feel pressure to push themselves to become bigger and bigger, because that's the only way they can push their boundaries, if you talk about how good you look with your muscles. Again, something that was never engaged with side opposition. Second, should we celebrate aesthetics? Because they come up here, right, and said that beauty is subjective. Tim comes up here and says, oh, beauty is arbitrary, there are blurred lines, why discriminate? But who is actually being discriminated? In fact, we are being subjective. Opposition here that says, let's be subjective and celebrate all forms of beauty. Oh, but if you're buff, by the way, we'll give you a trophy. Yeah. Whereas government told you that if you're buff, okay, cool, but we're not going to give you a trophy for it. If you're good looking, cool, go back to society. We're not going to reward you and give you a trophy for it. Because we told you, the moment you have a competition, a category where you promote that individual and you reward him with trophy, money, like media coverage, all of the perks of being a champion just because you're better looking than the rest of society, that's when you create pressure. Because you can come up here and say that's obscure all you want, though I think that's very unstrategic for your own case. The fact that it's a form of reward already gives the cue for people to start thinking. Because that's how society thinks. I told you in my PM speech, people gain perspective from what society chooses to reward and celebrate. The point at which we celebrate buff men and say that this is what we are rewarding, that becomes the expectation of how all men should look like and how all women should want their men to look like. That's when you socially engineer people. If we have been against the promotion of super skinny girls, if we have been against this promotion of only fair girls are beautiful, right? We always want diversity, yet we never reward them. Why shouldn't it extend to the idea of bodybuilding? Bodybuilding is not weightlifting. Bodybuilding isn't running or playing basketball. You are judged by how well you build your body and how good you look. I think that is a shame.
All right, thank both teams for that debate. Let's pass the floor. Please shake hands. Be nice, hug each other, comment, and give each other compliments, how you guys look, and then wait outside.